Today let's talk through every army in 40k, where I'd rank them on a tier list, and why. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd go through a 4-faction tier list. We haven't done one of these for a little while now, so I thought it was high time for another video on the subject. Over the last few months, with some of the more recent codex updates, I would argue that 9th edition has maybe got a little bit less balanced than it used to be. Some of the new codexes are very powerful indeed, and perhaps leaving some of those with 8th edition books behind in the dust. With that in mind, I've organised the armies into 4 rough tiers, talking about their relative strength to each other in my estimation, perhaps loosely based off the Warhammer Stats Centre performances of the army combined with my own opinions. Making tier lists like this isn't always going to be an exact science. There are a lot of ways that you could consider an army's strength, either their win percentage, the total number of tournament wins, and a lot of armies vary wildly in strength depending on whether you run them in more casual games versus running the most optimised list for the faction. You can also run a lot of armies either as allied or pure army lists, and again this can massively impact the strength whether or not some armies can bring some allies along. Whenever doing tier lists like this, there is the option whether or not to include Space Marines as one army, or 12 different ones, depending on whether you feel the codexes make them significantly divergent to be worth ranking separately. Currently Space Marines remain strong, though are maybe not entirely meta-dominant like they used to be. And for this list I've taken a bit of a half-half approach. I've ranked them as one option, and we'll discuss the relative strength of each chapter when we get to the entry. Finally, making tier lists like this is always a bit arbitrary. There's plenty of choices that I could have been persuaded to go up a tier or down a tier, so if you think that there's anything that's not ranked right, please let me know. Everyone's experience of 40k is different, and I look forward to hearing your opinions down in the comments. With all that said, let's jump into it and start out with tier 4. So in tier 4, I've chosen to rank Inquisition, Inari, Genestealer Cults, and Tau Empire. These are the factions that I feel are struggling the most in 40k right now, and very rarely see any sort of major appearance in high-ranking tournament lists. We'll start out with the Inquisition, who are arguably lowest of the low, mainly because they're basically unable to form a standalone army all by themselves. You can field Inquisition detachments, but you're generally going to need to ally them to another army if you want to fill out the points, and other than the actual Inquisitors, you don't really have much flexibility with the choices, and they aren't enormously strong. Inquisitors do occasionally make appearances in stronger lists though. Depending on the army, they can be well worth being a support character, offering things like a bit of psychic support, overwatch denial, or even providing invul saves. And with the Agent of the Imperium rules, they are fairly easy to include in Imperial detachments without messing things up. They're certainly not seen in every list though, and are still a bit more of a niche pick. They often have less synergy with the Codex's army than the actual in-Codex options, and sometimes they can mean that you have excessive HQs in a detachment when you might want to be focusing a bit more on warm bodies on the battle line. To be honest, it's probably for the best that Inquisitors aren't auto-includes, otherwise every Imperial army would run them, and they just really need their choices and options expanding if they're going to be run as a standalone army. Next up we come to Inari, who ever since they lost their borderline broken soulburst moves, where they could basically take entire actions and shooting phases and movement out of turn, have again been fairly niche in application within Eldari lists. At the moment, aside from their 3 main characters, the Inari mainly function as a chapter tactic, some stratagems, relics and warlord traits to apply to one of the Eldar detachments. The problem is that their strength through death rule generally tends to be weaker than the other benefits that you can get for going Craftworld, Drakari or Harlequins. Craftworlds get quite powerful Craftworld attributes, Drakari get their new power from pain, and Harlequins get Rising Crescendo. All of these usually tend to be better than the buffs that you get for going Inari. The main advantages of using them are getting mixed Eldar lists together, where they can all have a little bit of synergy. Inari tend to be fairly good in melee, so they can be quite a boost to certain melee units out of the Craftworlds and Drakari, and both Ivrain and the Incarn are quite powerful characters, and can add quite a lot when splashed into Harlequins or Eldar. Generally though, if Games Workshop does want to see entire armies of Inari take to the table, they would need a bit of a rules rewrite. Next up we come to Genestealer Cult, and the first proper fully supported faction on the list. I find it kind of interesting that Genestealer Cult are faring so poorly in 9th edition, as quite a lot of their rules do seem fairly favourable for it. Large units of murderous troops, killing enemy units in melee, and jumping straight out of deep strike when they can do nothing about it. Cult Ambush is fairly powerful, and they do have some fairly reasonable rugged shooting between things like their buggies and trucks. In general though, a lot of their codex remains very overcosted, and they perhaps slightly lack durable units that are just there to throw into the meat grinder, hold down objectives, and take a lot of enemy firepower. They have to pay quite a lot of command points if they want to get their nastiest tricks off, and I feel like in 9th edition there is a bit less emphasis on deep strike. Armies that used to fully deep strike before often are wanting to start on the table due to smaller boards and needing to get the damage and objectives captured right away. I still think they can work quite well as interesting allies for Tyranids or Imperial Guard, but to become their own strong force again, quite a lot of units need some points drops, particularly things like Aberrants. Finally, for Tier 5 we come to the Tau Empire, who have been enormously struggling since the start of 9th edition. Their drones were heavily nerfed, much of the codex is overcosted, and they get on with the 9th missions about as badly as any army can. They have little to no melee in an edition where you really need to hold the centre ground and charges are going to happen, and it means that they're often forced to advance into the midfield without units that are either particularly tanky or good in a fight in melee. I'm certainly not saying that they aren't without their strengths. Farside enclaves can give some decent close-range shooting with things like breachers or crisis bodyguard squads, and they might well be worth even more of a look now there's the recent boost to Montcar that Games Workshop confirmed that Tau can now fall back and shoot for definite with their recent FAQ. Their combined Overwatch can be quite intimidating as well, and I feel that Tau still can be strong at a more casual level. They just tend to really struggle when it gets to the biggest and toughest events. Next up we come to Tier 3, where I've ranked Imperial and Chaos Knights, Grey Knights, Thousand Sons, Craft Worlds, Astra Militarum, Tyranids, Chaos Space Marines, and Chaos Demons. They are roughly in an order of power, with the weakest being at the bottom and the strongest at the top. First up we have the Knights, which I was really debating whether or not to put them down in Tier 4 or at the bottom of Tier 3. Knights certainly haven't been looking too hot throughout most of 9th edition, as again they don't really get on very well with the missions, they struggle for OBSEC, interact quite poorly with all the new terrain rules, and anti-tank weapons are getting really quite strong in 9th edition. However, for all that, their raw power that they bring to the table is actually quite good. The Forge World Knight Questa Megara is really quite intimidating for the points, and Lightning Lock Armiger Moiraxes are seeing quite a bit of play in Chaos Knight lists. In addition, the Titan Hunter objective has been recently improved. Now you only score 4 points for the first Dead Knight, 9 for the second, and 15 for the third, and this is far less punishing to Knight lists than it used to be. And Chaos Knights have at least had a few strong tournament performances, often spamming Lightning Lock Moiraxes in addition to other Chaos forces. Still, despite some strengths, Knights really are struggling at the moment, hence I've ranked them quite so low, either bottom of Tier 3 or in Tier 4. Next up we have our first Space Marines in Grey Knights, who went from being at least relatively strong in 8th edition to seeing very little play at all in 9th. They did cop quite a few nerfs. Mass Smite was taken away from them when the edition came out. They'll be really keen to get their 2-wound Strike Marines and 3-wound Terminators, and the Abhor the Witch secondary still can be punishing to them, where provided you take out a decent chunk of the Grey Knight army, you're likely to score very high with it. I feel like they might have more problems on the way as well, as the new Sisters of Battle Codex seems to be amazing for denying psychic powers, and could perhaps present them with some real challenges. They do still have their advantages. Stacking psychic buffs on Terminators and Paladins can make them incredibly tanky and a real Death Star unit to take out. They've got a few deep strike tricks of their own, and fairly reasonable melee across the army, but they certainly could use a boost, and it's good that their new codex is coming out kind of soon. In a similar vein, we also have the Thousand Sons, who do seem to quite often see play in top Chaos lists, but usually as a minor ally to bring a few tricks rather than the majority of the army. Their psychic phase does understandably remain strong, though it was significantly toned down in the same way as Grey Knights, not being able to spam Smite for days anymore. Magnus can be an interesting addition to Chaos lists. He can be a really durable wrecking ball when buffed up to the max, and Ahriman often makes appearances in allied Chaos lists, buffing a Thousand Sons unit or two or Magnus, and confounding the enemy. They seem to be almost never seen on their own though. They really struggle for strong battle line units. Their Zangors, Rurit Marines and Terminators just really aren't quite cutting it right now. Abhor the Witch is another major turn-off, and again they'll be really looking forward to their new codex, where I'm sure they'll greatly benefit from a rewrite. Moving on, we come to the Craft World Eldar, who I feel are an army that's had a lot going for them, but in general throughout 9th edition has been hampered by a bunch of unfavourable points costs. They've got a strong psychic phase with some powerful buffs and debuffs. They have the potential to make units really tanky with +1 to saves and feel no pain, or debuff an enemy unit with -1 to save and re-rolling wounds against them. They've got good mobility. Their custom Craft World chapter tactic traits are very powerful indeed. They get the undiluted Master Artisan style re-rolls with 1 re-roll to hit and wound per unit, and can also ignore cover at range as well. Interestingly, they've also picked up a fair few nice points cuts in chapter approved, with things like Wraithblades and Dark Reapers dropping down a bit. I still think that quite a lot of their army does remain overcosted, and some units just a bit too fragile to make them work, or don't hit quite hard enough for that fragility. Again, they have struggled with the 9th edition missions a bit. It does emphasise having durable units to sit on midfield objectives, and craft worlds don't really have all that many options for that. I guess cheaper Wraithfoot blades might be a little bit more appealing, now they did drop a few points in chapter approved. Next up we come to the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard, who in general have been seeing a slow and steady decline, following their heyday being one of the strongest armies in the game at the start of 8th edition. In general, the Guard are a relatively durable but not all that hard-hitting army. Infantry squads and chimeras are quite an efficient choice for holding up objectives, or even just using move on expendable infantry squads to hold the line and move block the enemy. They do have a couple of powerful damage dealing pieces. Anti-tank demolisher tank commanders are very efficient, if perhaps a little bit vulnerable to being gunned straight off the table with no invul save, and they have one of the stronger artillery units in the game, with the full payload Manticore raining down damage 3 shots. In general though, they just don't bring all that much damage output, and they might struggle to take down some of the horrors that are put up against them. They are quite limited for melee options. Borgrin aren't too bad, but aside from that and maybe Kaschan infantry, they don't have some of the blender units that other armies have that just jump in and kill everything. The Guard do have quite a lot of options, but a lot of them do remain overcosted within the codex. About 1 in 2 units just really isn't worth taking compared with other options, so it doesn't help them enormously. In the new chapter approved as well, they did suffer a hefty nerf to their Death Riders of Krieg. Those incredibly tough Krieg horses were one of the strongest units that they had going, but have now taken a hefty nerf as they've gone all the way up to 20 points. Overall, Guard do have their tricks and merits, but they haven't really seen much success in the way of tournament wins, which does speak something for the overall strength of the faction. Next up we come to Tyranids, and we're now starting to get towards the slightly stronger end of Tier 3. Tyranids have seen themselves a few tournament wins over the last few months, and while perhaps quite a lot of their codex is a bit overcosted and easy to kill, they do have some tricks that are really powerful indeed. The Swarm Lord seems to be present in most lists, double moving Tyrannid critters or swarms towards the enemy, and potentially getting even more movement out of stratagems and psychic powers. With the Swarm Lord in either Gene Stealers or Dimacaron, they can easily pull off a melee alpha strike right from turn 1. They've got some reasonable shooting in Exocrines with their double firing, and Hiveguard, who are perhaps one of the most efficient ignores line of sight units in the entire game of 40k. Rippers and Lictors are both decent ways to secure objectives or perform actions, and they did get some very interesting points drops in the new chapter approved, with the already good Swarm Lord being buffed and Gene Stealers dropping down to 13 points where they're a lot more usable. Aside from these strong set pieces though, a lot of the units are still overcosted or easy to kill. The all-powerful Dimacarons that we're seeing a lot of play in competitive lists have been nerfed. They've gone up significantly in points now, and many of the rules from the old codex are starting to show their age. Still, I think when played smart, Tyranids certainly can ruin other armies' days. They do have a few cool tricks and combos. Next up we come to Chaos Space Marines, who, like demons that we'll talk about in a second, I feel are far stronger when combined with other Chaos allies than when run individually. For that reason, I've ranked both Chaos Space Marines and Chaos Demons at the top of Tier 3, though when combined I'll put them as a Tier 2 army. The main strength of the Chaos Marines tends to be when they get all sorts of stacking buffs going. They've got good psychic powers, stratagems, and Dark Apostle buffs, and the way that they're played typically seems to be stacking all of these buffs on things like Terminators with Lightning Claws and Combi Bolters, big squads of Possessed, or Slaneshi shooting options such as Noise Marines or Obliterators. It's hard to go too far wrong with a massive shooting unit, hitting on 2s with Prescient, and then firing twice with Endless Cacophony. Their Demon Engine playstyle might have seen a bit of a buff too. Venom Crawlers were kind of okay before, but have now seen a massive points decrease, going all the way down to 110 points. At that kind of price tag, I feel like a few are going to be finding their way into Chaos lists. For downsides, I feel that most of the army is a bit underwhelming when you're not layering all these buffs on them. I'm sure Chaos players are massively impatient to get their 2-wound Chaos Marines and 3-wound Terminators to put them back on par with Loyalists in that regard. Moving on, we come to Chaos Demons, which was an army that I was debating whether or not to put at the top of Tier 3 or towards the bottom of Tier 2. Much like Chaos Space Marines, they do tend to appear quite regularly in top tournament lists, but again almost exclusively in alliance with other armies, though they'll often be the faction that has the most points spent on it in a Chaos Super Alliance. Perhaps the biggest strength of the army are the exalted Greater Demons, particularly Keepers and Secrets and the Lord of Change. The Keepers can zip straight across the board and have some hefty melee damage. They're almost always going to make themselves a problem for the opponent very quickly, and Lords of Change often just use the single setup of the Impossible Robe and -1 damage combo, giving you a big, almost indestructible magic chicken who flies around casting spells and getting in the way. They can combine that with some durable units for objectives, Nodlings to start in the midfield and gum up the enemy deployment zone, and Beasts of Nurgle are very efficient and hard to remove. They don't do an absolute ton of damage, but just plonk a crazy amount of toughness 5 wounds with feel no pain on an objective. Perhaps one of the reasons that they get fielded as allies quite so regularly is that demons just don't really seem like a very well-rounded army. Their strong options are very strong, but a lot of their army I'd put in the kind of underwhelming territory, and in particular they don't really have many options for shooting units, which can be a bit of a weakness to a list. So now we get on to Tier 2, where I'll replace allied chaos lists, orcs, harlequins, space marines, necrons, adeptus custodes, and death guard. We've already talked about allied chaos lists to an extent, demons plus chaos space marines, and maybe throwing in Ahriman, Mortarion, or Magnus for a little bit of extra punch or psychic shenanigans. Generally combine a chaos space marine Death Star or two to layer some buffs on, a couple of exalted greater demons, and maybe Mortarion or Magnus himself flying around, and you can build a composite army with a lot of really hard-hitting punches. Next though, let's talk about the orcs, who do seem to have been putting in some fairly consistent performances throughout 9th, while not really being particularly dominant at any point. Some of their stronger lists either tend to revolve around Ghazghkull buffing hordes of goth orcs, or more Death Skull focused armies, comboing Bolgies and Dreads for some efficient shooting and melee, with some cheap deep striking units such as commandos to put those OBSEC bodies onto objectives. Quite a lot of their army does remain usable. They can get some very cheap mech gun fire support with smasher guns. Using Dajump with a Weird Boy can be a really efficient way to get orcs into combat. And for the points, a war boss on a warbike with a Dakila Claw and the brutal but cunning trait. It's one of the most fighty characters in the entire game. On the downside, if orcs are caught exposed, they can be cleared quite quickly. Some armies can put out some absolutely brutal amount of anti-horde firepower these days, particularly like the new Admech or Drakari witches just butchering them in close combat. I'd say in general their raw damage output is okay over the army, though not absolutely outstanding. Perhaps their strongest stuff comes in the form of a million AP0 chopper attacks, and that can be effective against some armies, but just might bounce off other armies with strong armour like Custodes or Death Guard. Despite this, orcs do seem to remain at least a reasonable contender, can certainly win their share of games, and the new codex that's coming with the toughness 5 boys and AP-1 choppers certainly sounds very very scary on paper. I'll certainly be looking forward to see what comes of that. Next up we come to Space Marines, who have chosen to rank in Tier 2 as a bit of an average. I think that some of their armies are definitely punching towards Tier 1, whereas some might be a bit more towards low Tier 2 to Tier 3 status. We'll talk through their specific chapters in a second, but just in general, Marines do have quite a lot going for them. They've got an enormous unit pool to draw from, they have tools for virtually every option, and in particular some of their best strengths are solid melter delivery units, things like attack bikes or eradicators. Very flexible and extensive troops choices where you can get the exact right sort of power armoured body for the job, and some tanky threatening melee options, including Blade Guard and Vanguard veterans with storm shields. On top of that, with all of their supplement books, you really can flavour your Marine army exactly the way that you like it. If you're going for Shock Assault melee, then maybe take Blood Angels or White Scars. Terminators can be very strong with Dark Angels, and for flexible firepower type armies, you could think about Ultramarines. There are a lot of advantages to Space Marines, but I no longer feel that they're quite as oppressive as they used to be. Now there's quite a lot of new codexes that have come out along the same sort of level. They also took a few recent nerfs in chapter approved, some of the most competitive units such as Vanguard veterans and attack bikes getting a bump, and the chapters themselves do vary quite vastly in strength. An army of Space Marines can be anything from a fairly fun and fluffy force to something that's really quite top tier. Talking through the chapters, here's my rough estimations of which ones are the strongest or weakest. I would argue that at the moment the Dark Angels do seem to be retaining their crown as the strongest Space Marine chapter. Just for a lot of strategies, they do seem to be the best option. Ridiculously durable Terminators and Blade Guard that can only be wounded on a 4+ at all times. They also get OBSEC thrown in for free. Nice buffs to bikes with a 5+ invul save, and any fire support unit will be firing just that bit better as they get a +1 to hit when they don't move. It's really hard to go too far wrong with Dark Angel's armies right now. They bring a lot of powerful abilities to the table. There's plenty of other chapters hot on their heels though. White Scars are fast, hard-hitting, with a great chapter tactic and combat doctrine. Ultramarines are able to redeploy units, including Invicta tactical warsuits. They have the powerful Seal of Oath for rerolls, and lots of solid buffing characters that can really turn a standard battle line into something even more dangerous. Space Wolves again are incredibly hard-hitting. Particularly Space Wolf successors with both the damage-dealing chapter traits seem to be quite popular. Exploding 6s and +1 to hit makes for incredibly dangerous close combat units, and then you can stack that with stratagems and options to make them even stronger. Blood Angels are great almost for their chapter tactic alone. +1 to wound and +1 to charge is excellent for a Marine melee army, and Sanguinary Guard remain an absolutely great option, even though they took a small points hit in chapter approved. They still do everything pretty well: speed, damage, and even some reasonable durability with -1 to hit in melee. Salamanders were really powerful at the start of 9th, though got a bit of a nerf from the new Marine Codex, losing things like Flamestorm aggressors being able to fire twice. They still bring a very good amount of raw power though. Their Melter and Flamers are really dangerous. They've got some good stratagems for getting even more out of those, and have some quite nice psychic powers and warlord traits too. Then we come to the Marine chapters that are perhaps struggling the most and aren't seeing anywhere near as much tournament play. All of these might be lower tier 2, or maybe even down to tier 3. The monstrously powerful Iron Hands of 8th edition have come down quite a bit. They do provide some good durability and synergies with vehicles, and solid Alpha Strike with their first turn Devastator doctrine. They still bring some good tricks, but aren't anywhere near as oppressive as they used to be. Raven Guard do seem to be a bit limited in scope. I did make a full video on them a few weeks back, so you can check that out and search it if you'd like. They've got some nice pre-game redeployment options and putting things in Deep Strike. They may be strongest in a successor chapter, bringing things like first turn charges with Vanguard Vets or scary deep striking Assault Centurions. Since their codex dropped, Deathwatch have had almost no strong tournament performances, maybe people choosing to run armies of other things. I feel like the core of their codex is just a bit lackluster, although they do have multiple interesting tricks. Redemptors with invulnerable saves, teleporting squads around the board, and messing with their order of their doctrines, but it just doesn't really seem to have been enough to break through. Special issue ammunition has also been drastically reduced, only available on their standard bolters. Imperial Fists have just been a bit underwhelming for a while now. Out of all the supplement books, I feel like theirs has one of the weakest options. They've got a really strong chapter tactic with exploding 6s on the bolters and ignoring cover when shooting, but aside from that and maybe the Eye of Hypnoth, not a lot of options are really all that exciting. Their best bet's going very heavy on the bolt weapons, but they are in contention for one of the weakest chapters in 9th. Finally, Black Templars I feel are kind of similar to Deathwatch. They've got a ton of really quite interesting and powerful tricks within their index, but it just doesn't seem to quite add up to enough to compete with the other assault armies. They've got their own unique litanies, very cheap Crusader squads, and they can use Devout Push for all sorts of shenanigans, but it doesn't quite seem to make up for a slightly underwhelming chapter tactic and unique doctrine. Overall, as a whole though, Space Marines do remain very strong. They're a very common sight on the podiums of tournaments, as quite so many people play them, and certainly Dark Angels are punching well above the weight of the average, and would be an army that I'd consider the top of tier 2, maybe even getting towards tier 1. Next up we come to the Harlequins, who perhaps slightly surprisingly became a really dominant force towards the start of 9th edition, though they have been starting to drop off a bit more recently. Maybe Eldari players starting to go a bit more towards the new Drukhari, as another Eldari light transport army, but with quite a few more options on the table. In any case, Harlequins remain very strong indeed, a high win percentage at tournaments, and they have a ton of powerful options and stratagems with some enormously frustrating tricks. Shadow Seers can keep a bunch of units safe and count as being further away to shoot. Fusion Pistol Starweavers in the Soaring Spite can move really far and then delete enemy units with their fusion pistols. And Skyweaver jet bikes can make great use of the Harlequin stratagems, potentially charging in, doing loads of damage, and then falling back so far that the enemy can't get to grips with them the next turn. Being really mobile and having lots of objectives secured about for 9th missions isn't a bad thing either. Generally, Harlequin's main weakness is their very limited options, and sometimes they will add in a bit of Craftworld Eldar or Drukhari just to cover some options for other battlefield roles. They still look to be at least reasonably solid though, even if maybe not quite on the same level with the newest 9th codexes. Next up we come to the Necrons, and it's been good to see the primary antagonists of 9th edition still putting in solid performances at events. Necrons work pretty well with the 9th missions, putting some incredibly durable units onto objectives, things like Warriors and Scarabs, maybe backed up with a Chronomancer for a 5+ invul. The vast majority of top Necron lists bring the Silent King, an enormously powerful centerboard threat to make enemy units fight twice, and also provide a little bit of powerful shooting and very good buffs. And it's nice to have the option of the Nightbringer as well if he makes sense in a list. Blasting mortal wounds around and being able to cut down any one character is a really powerful piece to have. Warriors with Gauss Reapers can provide some fairly good close-range shooting, and they can get there with either the Veil of Darkness or Ghost Arcs, and in the recent chapter approved they've seen some buffs to their anti-armor options, things like Doomsday Arcs and Locust Heavy Destroyers. It'll be interesting to see if they start to see some more play. Their main weaknesses are being at least somewhat slow-moving, and their damage output not being absolutely overwhelming compared with other factions. They definitely have a bit more of a playstyle that is about grinding enemies down, as opposed to just alpha striking them straight off the table. Still though, remain solid, I'd certainly consider them a good tier 2 army. Next we have the Adeptus Custodes. Along with Harlequins, perhaps one of the armies that really had their 8th edition codex really come into its own in 9th. with their very tough hyper-elite infantry being kind of suited to taking and holding the centre of the table against all comers. They can be really tough to shift units of these guys, units like the Telemon Dreadnought, Custodian Guard with Storm Shields, or ridiculously durable HQ options such as the Shield Captain on the Dawn Eagle jetbike with a 3+ invul. Almost every unit has pretty convincing melee, they get army-wide obsec on all of their infantry and bikes, and they can splash in some Forge World units if they want a little bit of extra fire support. Perhaps one of their biggest weaknesses is being hyper-elite, and quite a few units being fairly slow-moving. If the enemy does have the damage output just to sledgehammer them straight off the table, then they might be in a tricky position to respond. A few playstyles just really don't work all that well with them, as they don't have that many units for screening expendable units or units to do actions. I guess some allied scions or bringing some Sisters of Silence could help plug those gaps though. In any case, it's looking good for the Custodies at the moment. Finally for Tier 2, and an army that's certainly pushing towards Tier 1, are the Death Guard. I could happily have ranked them towards the top of Tier 2, or somewhere in Tier 1. I feel they're maybe just a little bit borderline. As having a really recent 9th Codex, Death Guard certainly seem to have benefited from a bit of the Codex creep that's been going on in 9th. Their units are ridiculously tough pretty much across the board, with particular standouts being their Poxwalkers, Terminators, Mortarion, and Demon Engines. The Codex is quite well internally balanced, most units having a reasonable battlefield role to include, maybe relying on Mortarion and Deathshroud Terminators as primary damage dealers, Poxwalkers to hold objectives and maybe surprise people with a bunch of mortal wounds in melee, a couple of Demon Engines for fire support, and some powerful support characters to bring along such as the Foul Blightspawn, which can make enemy units fight last. Contagions of Nurgle allows them to deal a bit more damage to enemy units when up close, and disgustingly resilient with army-wide -1 damage makes them uniquely tough against damage 2 weapons. It means that enemy anti-tank weapons are going to be really stretched when dealing with the Death Guard. For some downsides, they are generally quite slow when they get on the table, and aside from a couple of examples such as Mortarion and Terminators, most of their damage output isn't enormously outstanding. It's kind of fine with their playstyle though, they just want to grind the enemy down with being really durable and chip damage, and they make up for their damage with excessive toughness. Certainly one of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40K. Finally, we get into the very top tier codexes, and here I've chosen to rank Drukhari, Adeptus Auroritus, and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Perhaps no small coincidence that they are also the last codexes that have been released. Power creep certainly remains alive and well. Perhaps the Sisters of Battle might be a bit of a tentative pick at the moment. Their codex has only been revealed for a little while, and they haven't had any new tournaments played with it yet. However, like Custodians and Harlequins, the Sisters were doing absolutely fine with their 8th edition codex, and frequently placing very well in big tournaments. It'll take a little while for people to get their heads around the army, and decide on which of the combos and options available are the strongest, but just from my first impressions of the codex, it does look like they're going to be similarly strong, if not stronger. The Sisters have a ton of things going for them, both powerful shooting and melee, and some really helpful army-wide mechanics, including Miracle Dice, allowing them to make some automatic saves, high damage rolls, and automatic charges when it counts, and Sacred Rites giving you some flexible whole army buffs. Some very strong ones for melee units, but they can also flex that out for a 5+ deny against Psykers, which could really ruin the strategy of things like Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. Morven Val might be one of the strongest units within the new codex, both being a very efficient damage dealer in herself, and also being able to take the Sisters around her to the next level in terms of shooting and damage output. The Bloody Rose Order still seems very strong as well, getting extra attacks and AP on units like Repentia and Sacrosanct seems great. Mortifiers and Penitent Engines both seem a bit undercosted for what they do, tough to remove, good shooting and good melee, and between their myriad of buffing characters, war hymns, relics, warlord traits, and the new Blessings of the Faithful, there are a lot of ways to add extra power to Sisters' core units. It'll be interesting which ones people decide to combo and become more common in Sisters' lists. With the new decks, the Sisters haven't had it all their own way, in particular Retributors copped a bit of a nerf, losing their good stratagems and no longer being able to move and fire for no penalty. They could still perhaps have a role though in Argent Shroud lists. In general though, the Sisters do seem very strong, and I suspect that we'll continue to see the strong tournament performances they've had into the future. Next up we come to the Adeptus Mechanicus, who have enormously changed with their recent codex and look like they'll be having a very different playstyle going forward. It looks like Admech might have arguably the very strongest shooting in the game right now, particularly revolving around some of their 3 strong core options, Skitarii Rangers and Vanguard, and Iron Strider Ballistari. 160 points of Skitarii Vanguard, when you use a 1 command point stratagem, will on average deal 30 wounds to any non-vehicle target, which is pretty crazy stacking of damage. Up close, the Rangers can dish out an 80 Strength 4 AP-1 shots on their targets, and the Ballistari with the las cannons are perhaps the most efficient long-ranged anti-tank unit in the game. 2 las cannons with D3+3 damage for just 75 points is absolutely ludicrous. They can then stack that with good buffs from Skitarii Marshals and their Warlord traits, Tech Priests and their Holy Order buffs, and the very powerful Doctrina Imperatives, and perhaps even Canticles of the Omnissiah if you're playing Mars as well. In addition, they have a bunch of powerful spoiler units as well. Fusiliers can flap about and slow enemy movement while bombing enemy units out of existence, and the Cerberus Raiders are still a great screening unit, being able to make themselves almost unchargeable with Tactica Obliqua. For weaknesses, they aren't really all that durable if they are caught out in the open by the enemy, and perhaps aside from these main core choices, a lot of the codex is maybe a little bit overshadowed. Most of it still remains very usable, but just doesn't really feel like it's quite on the same power level as these core choices. I still think that these power units are enough to see them through though. Going up against a full AdMech gunline could be seriously scary indeed. Finally, we come to the Drukhari, who are quite possibly the single strongest 9th edition codex that Games Workshop have released so far. They've been scary to the extent where Games Workshop has seen fit to already nerf them in an emergency balance patch, and at time of recording they're still sitting with a 70% win rate at tournaments, which is almost unheard of since Iron Hands in 8th. Drukhari have an absolute ton of things going for them. They're ridiculously mobile, with their Raiders, fast movement profiles, and power from pain, which allows them to advance and charge turn 2 onwards. Their melee units will punch far above their points costs, whether that's big blocks of witches, incubi, or their incredibly cheap and destructive characters. The Succubus still remains perhaps one of the fightiest characters in Warhammer 40K, a 60-point unit that could easily kill 2 or 3 times the points cost if the stars aligned. Dark Lances provide some nice anti-tank shooting, and Raiders are still excellent transports, even despite being slightly nerfed up to 95 points in the latest balance patch. Finally, they're very solid for mission objectives too. Cheap, fast and Auspex units are both great for scoring primaries, and also performing actions for secondaries too. In general, I do still feel that perhaps Drukhari are maybe the army to beat in 9th edition, even since they had some balance changes when both their Raiders and Drazar went up in points, and the very brutal Dark Technomancer's trait for the Homunculi was nerfed to no longer work on liquefier guns. Still though, the Drukhari look ridiculously strong. Against an optimised list played well, almost every faction is really going to struggle. So that, as always, let me know what you think of the tier list. Do you feel that it's fairly accurate, or would you rate any armies higher or lower than I've mentioned them? Please let me know down in the comments below. If you'd like to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I do try and keep a fair amount of 40k game related content coming. Finally, if you have been enjoying my videos recently, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is one way that you can help keep them coming. Making all the videos, particularly long ones like this, does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.